Hi, I'm Brian Russell, and today I want to talk with you for a few minutes about how to apply your learning and inductive Bible study to your weekly preaching or teaching. One of the keys and one of the struggles that students have is sometimes inductive Bible study seems like a lot of mechanics with very little payoff at the end. Now, what's critical here, before we even get to talking about preaching, is that you critically reflect not just on what the text meant, but you do the work of evaluation and application. So I encourage you to check out those videos first, because I'm assuming that you understand the full process of beginning with prayer to doing survey, interpretation, evaluation, and application. Because here's one of the keys. When you want to move from the text to the sermon, you want to remember that you're preaching the application of the text, or your applications. One of the mistakes that students often make with inductive Bible study is they're so fascinated with all the cool little nuggets and learnings they get about the text in terms of maybe its historical background, the meaning of a word, what a text would have sounded like, say if you're reading Paul's letter to the Romans, what the Roman background might have meant. So we end up talking a lot about telling people interesting things about the Bible. But here's the critical key. If you want to be an inspiring, compelling interpreter of Scripture, the kind of speaker, the kind of preacher, the kind of teacher that our world desperately needs, we don't need more people just teaching people interesting things about the Bible. We need to help people hear the demands of the text itself. What is the text calling us to do? How is the text calling us to realign with God? How is this text shaping us for mission? How is this text creating us into a community? So we're going to be preaching the application. So I encourage you to go back and look at videos on applying GPS, map. You'll find them in the playlist on Inductive Bible Study that talks about how to do evaluation application. That's critical. Now, having said that, how can Inductive Bible Study help you with your preaching? Well, beyond just the fact that you can go from text to sermon, let me talk about a bigger picture. I've been the pastor of multiple congregations. I served a church full-time in Kentucky, meaning I preached Sunday morning, Sunday night. I served a church in Richmond, Virginia. I preached a couple times a month in a church in Florida, and then in a church plant, I was the main teaching pastor. So I've experienced with 4 different congregations. So I've preached a lot. Plus I've been a guest speaker, and now I'm going to say close to 100 different congregations. So I've preached in my lifetime over 1,000 sermons now. And what I've found is that inductive Bible study has made me a profoundly better preacher, whether it's being a guest speaker now in most cases, but when I was doing the week in, week out work, inductive Bible study set me up for success. And here's how. What I would do, and I'd recommend 2 different techniques. I'm an advocate of preaching books of the Scriptures. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about preaching every single verse, but I think it's critical for us to preach series that are rooted in biblical books. Now, this doesn't necessarily fly against, say, lectionary preaching, because if you know the lectionary, for example, depending on whether you're in year A, B, or C, that runs through text cyclically. So you can actually apply what I'm talking about if you're a lectionary preacher. But one of the key things is if you preach books, and again, you decide how long you want to stay in a particular book, because inductive Bible study can set you up for whether you want to do a sermon series of maybe 4 or 5 weeks, 8 weeks, a quarter, or even if you wanted to preach one of the longer books and do most of it, if you could go on months on end. So here's how inductive Bible study can really set you up for success, especially if you preach a series. Your book survey becomes the launching pad. if you preach a different book of the Bible every week, you don't have time to do the book survey. But if you're going to commit to a series, your initial preparation for the series can be a book survey. And the great thing about that is that allows you to see the entire book, and it's also something you can refer back to each week. Because if you recall, what does a book survey do? You're going to get an outline, you're going to get the structures, and based on those two things, your main units, your subunits, and the structures, you're going to locate strategic areas for each structure. And so one of the things initially is you can essentially, for your series, you can preach strategic areas. So that gives you your texts, but notice what we've done now. Because we've actually selected strategic areas based on the structures, you know that you're actually preaching the most important parts of each book, right? Now, if you want to do more than just 4 or 5 weeks, if you do 4 or 5 weeks, that's basically your book survey is going to give you roughly, you're going to usually have 3 to 4 or 5 structures. You're going to get 3 to 4 or 5 strategic areas to preach that sermon. If you're going to go beyond that, what you simply do is beyond the book survey, you can also do smaller surveys of the main units, which will then again give you strategic areas. So use inductive Bible study and the ability to locate strategic areas to set you up for success in your preaching. I have another video in my playlist on the book of Philippians that talks about how structure leads to meaning. If you watch that video carefully now, having heard what I just said, you'll be able to see how a book survey serves to aid you in interpretation and set you up that way. So that's one thing. So if you focus on preaching series, you can go from text to sermon quite easily, and you can have a coherent, logical basis. Okay, that's one way to preach series. Now, let's just say that you're going to week in and week out use inductive Bible study, and you're not going to preach books or even chunks of books or do series, or your series perhaps are more random passages that maybe you found thematically or whatever. You can still use inductive Bible study very effectively. But here instead, if you're going to preach just a text, so let's say I'm going to preach a paragraph. Let's say I'm preaching on Philippians. Let's throw this out. Philippians 1, 27 to 30. Again, I'll refer to that. If you go look at that Philippians video, you see this is a very important text. So let's say you're looking at this paragraph. Well, what can you do with inductive Bible study? What can you learn? Well, you don't necessarily have time to do a whole survey of Philippians. Again, if you have time, you read through the whole book to see what it is. But what you can do then is, because we've already kind of narrowed our text down to a paragraph, you can do a little mini survey of the paragraph. In other words, do a logical flow of this text. Do some deep dive observations, inferences. You might start with a detailed analysis. And remember, what detailed analysis observation does is you make a series of observations on the text, and what does that generate? You remember? Questions, right? And then after you've done this detailed observation, you've got a list of key questions. So you could spend, say, on a week, 2-3 hours doing careful observations of the context of a paragraph, and then generate questions. And your job then is to figure out, okay, what are the key questions that if I answered, I would have real insight into the passage, right? And so start with your questions here. So instead of doing survey, you start with detailed observation. Pick a couple of key questions. And then you do what? You answer those questions through the process of interpretation, right? And so how are you going to do that? Well, you have a bunch of observations already, so you already have your immediate context. So based on all the observations that you've already made, what are some inferences that you can begin to draw that will answer the questions that you raised in this? Okay, and then what do you do for the rest of it? Well, you want to fill out from the context. So then, at least back out a couple paragraphs before Philippians, 1:27 to 30 and a few paragraphs afterwards, and ask yourself, what does the wider context, what's here that might help me to answer my questions? And that way you're doing a broader context, and if you have time, you can try to draw some things out of the book as a whole, though that's harder when you're doing one-off sermons. So again, you're going to focus real attention on the immediate context with detailed observation. You're going to raise questions. You're going to then try to answer the key questions with the data you already have, and then maybe expand that to a few paragraphs before, a few paragraphs after. And then what do? Just like we learned in the interpretation process, you're going to fill out that interpretation, maybe do some limited word study, some historical background work. If you know Greek or Hebrew, you can take a look at some key pieces within the original language. You can look at parallel passages if any exist. You're just looking for additional data, and then you'll do the process of evaluation, application, and there you have your sermon. So these are really the two ways that inductive Bible study sets you up for success, long-term teaching and preaching. Again, I think to get the most real value for the amount of time, if you build series, each sermon builds on what you've done before. Those of you who took a class with me at Asbury Seminary know that, like we did a lot of work with Matthew, you could go back and preach through that. Those who've had other Psalms or Pentateuch or minor prophets with me, or taking classes with some of the other inductive Bible study preachers or teachers, you know that you have a lot of material then that lets you can refer back to those surveys. This lets you build a series out. Now again, if you're going to be a kind of more of a random preacher of the Bible, again, whether you're following a lectionary and just picking one of the four texts, you can use this method, starting with detailed observation and moving ahead. Again, I'm Brian Russell. It's my real privilege to make this video. Again, I know this is a short one. If you have questions, send them in. Put them in the comments. I'll interact with you. If I could be of any service to you, don't hesitate to reach out to me.